mentioned Bakhmut because I'm seeing now cauldrons taking place, Bakhmut being quite important, being encircled, but over the past few days, suddenly the Russians made some big leaps, encircling Avdiivka as well. This always creates a dilemma for Ukraine because do they keep pumping manpower in where they get chewed up and have these horrific losses, or do they walk away but then lose strategic territory? So how it begs the question, because if you follow the Western media, Bakhmut was super important, but now that is being lost, it's just it's just symbolic town. It doesn't mean anything. So how do you see this? Is Bakhmut important, and if so, why?
Well, based upon what I know, I have not been to Bakhmut, so I don't know what it looks like on the ground. I only know what I see on the map and what people that are there and have been there tell me. Yes, it does seem to be the keystone in the edifice of defense for the Donbass. And that once it is lost, the road nets, railheads, warehouses, mines, all these things will be permanently in Russian hands. There's no question about that. That's going to harm Ukraine. But right now, the Russians already occupy 90% of the territory that is responsible, or excuse me, the territory which is responsible for 90% of Ukrainian gross national product. So the Ukrainians are already at a severe disadvantage. I don't think it's going to improve when Bakhmut is finally lost. But for the Russians, it has made a lot of sense, to be frank, to leave the road open into Bakhmut. If the Ukrainians are going to pour more troops in there, it is easier now than it was 3 months ago or 6 months ago to destroy them, because they've set up this ISR strike zone. They sometimes call it a fire trap. And it works very, very effectively. I mean, if you can destroy your enemy without closing with him in close combat, that means you take no casualties in most cases. So this is very favorable to the Russian side. And right now, since the Russians cannot rely on numbers and platforms to move forward, this is a very positive development for them militarily. And it will continue as long as the Ukrainians feed this fire. It's tragic. Again, we need someone to intervene and say, look, this is taking us nowhere. But instead, you talked about the ICC thing. We just had an incident where a couple of B-52s apparently were on exercise in the Baltic. And I'm told that the exercise involved simulating the launch of cruise missiles in the direction of Russia. I mean, this is insanity. Why would you do such a thing in the middle of all this? Doesn't make any sense at all. The Russian fighters came up. We didn't violate Russian airspace per se, but you can fire a cruise missile from a B-52 bomber without flying anywhere near Russia. But this was actually over the Baltic, aimed at St. Petersburg. This is stupid. Just as the MQ-29 that was either shot down or disabled and fell into the Black Sea was trying to gather targeting data from Crimea. Again, what did you expect to happen? What would we do if the Russians did something similar off the coast of Virginia near Norfolk, where we have one of the largest concentrations of American naval power, or San Diego, or Puget Sound, any number of places where we have huge concentrations of naval power? We would have acted in precisely the same way. But this simply is like throwing gasoline on the fire that you should be interested in putting out. That's what's really disturbing.
Yeah, the drone was quite interesting. From what I read, it was 60 kilometers away from Russia's naval base in Sevastopol. Transponders were shut off, and of course, it's there to collect data which can be given to the Ukrainian for targeting. So it's I like how you framed it. What would we do if it was reversed? It's hard to see. Yeah, us reacting in it differently. I wanted to ask you about this planned offensive, though. This is by the Ukrainians. They're arguing that this been dubbed the last chance offensive because well, many in the West are pinning the hopes on the Ukrainians being able to make some advances. I think it was the Czech president or who argued that if this doesn't work, we can't continue funding the army. So again, for good reasons, it's being called the last chance offensive. But how are you reading this? Do you see Ukraine having sufficient manpower, equipment, and ability to use this equipment? I know again you don't have a crystal ball, but based on the information you have, well, what do you see the chances of success being? Sorry.
I think it's very low. The notion that they're going to launch some miraculous offensive involving 1,000 drones and tens of thousands of troops and somehow or another surprise the Russians and break through, I think is unrealistic. And again, the Russians have demonstrated they understand well how to entice the enemy into an attack. Let them press forward, and once they've pressed forward, encircle and destroy them. This is the oldest tactic in the world. This is what the Mongolian armies used against the Europeans in the 13th century. You can go back and look at it, whether it was the Poles, the Hungarians, at the time the Kievan Rus. Again and again, the Mongols would fall back in front of them. They would follow, and only to discover that they were suddenly surrounded on 3 or almost 4 sides and they were annihilated. I think the Russians will do that again. So no, I don't see really this being helpful at all. And it was the Czech president. And his point was, if this doesn't work, and I'm sure he knows that it won't, it suggests it doesn't make much sense to continue reinforcing failure. And it's not just a question of reinforcing failure, it's inviting more people to die pointlessly. That's the problem. What about the future of Ukraine? Nobody seems to give a damn, as far as I can tell, in the West about that. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I certainly don't see much concern for it here. It's this silly notion, well, we're winning because we're harming Russia. Well, I don't see the harm coming to Russia. I mean, certainly every war harms everyone who goes into it at some point. But right now, Ukraine is largely destroyed. So I wish I had some good news, but no, I don't think it can succeed at this stage. And my great worry is that once the Russians close in on the Dnieper River, and if we do not talk to them, they make the decision to cross the river, that we will be stupid. And we on the ground with the Poles and perhaps some others in the so-called coalition of the willing will try to intervene in Western Ukraine. There are foolish people who think that we can establish a new east-west border along the Dnieper River on the model of East and West Germany, for those in the audience that can remember that. And that's not something that I think Europeans should want. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's counterproductive, and we don't need to go down that road. And if we do, it will harm Europe irreparably.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out where we're going to go, because now it seems that as Ukraine is collapsing, we're at the crossroads. So either we can escalate by joining in on the war, or we can, as you said, the discussions about finding an off-ramp. So that's why I'm a bit confused, because I'm getting signals both ways. On one hand, you're having Victoria Nuland saying, you know, the Ukrainians should attack Crimea, and we will help them to do this. And then you have John Kirby, the National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator at the White House, saying, you know, we find any compromise or any ceasefire to be unacceptable. So there doesn't seem to be. They seem to be all for continue the fight, no ceasefire. On the other hand, you're getting these other voices from the president of the Czech Republic saying, we'll give Ukraine one more offensive, but after this we have to start cutting back. So this is why I'm confused. Where we're heading on this crossroad, or no decision has been made yet.
I think it's very important for the European leadership to take this in hand, because if they do not, I don't see much readiness at the top of the Biden administration to step forward and say, look, we miscalculated. We did not believe that Russia would come roaring back to life in the way that it has. We thought Russia was weak. We thought Russia could be bullied. We were wrong. You're not going to hear anybody in Washington admit that. And the other thing is the Europeans have to be forthright and honest. Are we going to see hundreds of thousands of Italians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Norwegians, Danes, Dutchmen, Germans all line up being outfitted and equipped to fight a high-end conventional war in Ukraine against Russia? Is that going to happen? Is there an appetite for that? Is that what these governments want to do? there's no appetite for it inside the United States. I mean, we're having trouble right now recruiting for the armed forces, largely because the armed forces have been demoralized and ruined in recent years, not just by bad decisions on acquisition and organization, but now bad policies regarding transgender and all sorts of equity craziness that essentially destroy the legitimacy of the institution. The armed forces has never been perfect, but it has tried to be a level playing field. And you can't run a military establishment when you are favoring one ethnic group or racial group or sexual preference group over another. This is disastrous. So I don't see anything happening in the United States along those lines. So you tell me, are the Europeans prepared to suit up and go fight in Ukraine, other than the Poles?
Well, my first instinct would be no. I don't think we would want to sacrifice our own. I think the way we speak about fighting Russians, I don't think we would talk in this manner if we were fighting with our own men. I think using Ukrainian men makes it easier. But on the other hand, again, there's never any clear signals. All the mistakes we've done with Russia, and again, I've been arguing for 10 years, if we try to put NATO in Ukraine, there will be war. And I'm also saying if we try to push for secession of Taiwan from China, there will always also be war, but we keep going in that direction as well. There's no critical debate about confronting China, and it's always referred to moral arguments, but at the end of the day, if the consequence will be war, it's unclear why this will be the moral thing to do. But it's there's an absence of a sensible debate, I would argue. But yeah, just as a final question before you have to go, I was wondering, do you think when the Russian offensive come, like you mentioned, they're waiting for the ground to be less muddy, but do you see them putting all their men into the fight? Because wouldn't they need to have a big standing army as a deterrent against NATO? As you mentioned, we might get some ideas of intervening. Surely, they would like to have 200,000-300,000 men standing there just as a warning that they can also, destroy NATO if they want to intervene. Or do you see them throwing everything in?
Well, first of all, you've got a total in and around Ukraine of about 540,000 Russian troops. Beyond that, you have another 200,000 that are in support. So you're over the 700,000 mark. How much of that do you need to be successful in Ukraine is a judgment call that only the high command can make in Moscow. I don't have a feel for that. My suspicion is that given the horrific losses, you will not need all of that force to deal with it. So I would expect that a large portion of the force, it may be the portion that sits in White Russia right now, which is over 100,000. Some people say it's 150,000. That force may be exactly what you just described. It may be there as the strategic hedge against NATO intervention. You've got another 300 to 400,000 in and around Ukraine in the east of the river. That's probably sufficient to deal with whatever remains of the Ukrainian forces in the spring. Again, we're all shooting in the dark. We don't know with precision, but I suspect you're right. There will be a large reserve on hand to deal with any NATO intervention. And again, that's something that we need to consider carefully because we don't have much depth in our force. You've got 50,000 U.S. troops. How many of that consists of combat troops? How many replacements do we have standing by when it takes casualties? How much fuel? How much ammunition? How many repair parts? And if we're going to fly aircraft in support, how many aircraft are we prepared to lose, not just to integrated air defenses, but also potentially sitting on the ground in airfields across Eastern Europe? I mean, the Russians know where all the airfields are. It's not a secret. It's easy to strike those places. What does that mean for our naval forces in the Adriatic and the Eastern Mediterranean? What does it mean for our naval forces off the coast of Norway, in the North Sea? Again, all these questions have to be addressed seriously before any consideration is made to intervene in the region. I hope that that's happening. My suspicion is it is, and I get the impression that the senior military leadership in the United States is more sober-minded than the political leadership and has tried to tell people this cannot continue indefinitely. We've got to come to some sort of arrangement. but no one is yet prepared to listen to that in the White House.